It was a harsh, unforgiving night in downtown Chicago when the millionaire pretended to sleep in his sleek glass-walled office to catch the janitor in the act. But what he wasn't prepared for was to wake up to a whispered confession, raw and heartfelt. "I wish I had your life, and your heart too." I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sweeping a hallway, checking the cameras, or locking the building doors for the night. It doesn't matter what time it is. But I promise you, today's story will shake your heart. Harold Washington, yes, named after Chicago's beloved mayor, had been cleaning the towering Crane Financial Building for 17 years. 17 years of watching the sun rise through 40-story windows while the city slept. 17 years of polishing marble floors that reflected the ambitions of men who never bothered to learn his name. His world was painted in muted grays and the amber glow of emergency lighting, the kind that stayed on when powerful men went home to their Lincoln Park mansions and Gold Coast penthouses. The building stood like a monument to capitalism on West Monroe Street, its steel and glass facade catching the reflection of the Chicago River at dawn. Harold knew every inch of it, from the executive washrooms on the 40th floor to the forgotten storage rooms in the basement where old filing cabinets held secrets older than the internet. His hands, weathered and strong despite his 63 years, moved with the precision of a craftsman. Each sweep of his mop, each careful dusting of mahogany conference tables, was performed with a dignity that the building's inhabitants couldn't see but somehow depended upon. Harold's uniform was always pressed, his gray hair always neat beneath his Cubs baseball cap. A small rebellion in a building where everyone wore ties that cost more than his monthly rent. He lived in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, a neighborhood where the scent of fresh tortillas mixed with the industrial smell of the nearby factories. His wife, Maria, had passed 3 years ago, leaving him with memories, a paid-off mortgage, and a photograph on his nightstand that he touched gently each morning before heading to work. The millionaire, Robert Crane III, was everything Harold was not. At 45, Crane commanded a financial empire built on cryptocurrency investments, real estate portfolios, and stock market manipulation that skirted the edge of legality. His wealth was measured not just in millions, but in the kind of generational money that bought senators and silenced journalists. His office occupied the entire top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a god's-eye view of the city his money helped shape. Crane moved through life with the careless arrogance of a man who had never been told no, never been invisible, never wondered if there was enough money left for groceries at the end of the month. His Italian leather shoes, each pair worth more than Harold made in 2 months, clicked against marble floors with the rhythm of entitlement. When he looked at Harold, if he looked at all, he saw nothing more than part of the building's infrastructure, as essential and unnoticed as the elevator cables or the air conditioning system. Harold, meanwhile, saw everything. He saw the late-night meetings where briefcases full of cash changed hands. He saw the shredded documents that weren't quite destroyed, the phone calls taken behind closed doors, the tears of bankruptcy that fell on expensive Persian rugs. He saw Crane's sister, Elizabeth, a kind woman who always said good morning and asked about his arthritis. She was the only Crane family member who remembered he was human. In his silence, Harold had become the building's memory. He remembered which executives arrived drunk, which ones stayed past midnight cooking the books, which ones brought their mistresses to the corporate apartments upstairs. He remembered every conversation that echoed in empty hallways, every whispered conspiracy. Every moment when powerful people thought no one was listening. But Harold was always listening, always there, invisible as dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight. The rhythm of his nights was as predictable as Lake Michigan's tides. 9 p.m., empty the executive trash bins, noting the crumpled contracts and hastily deleted emails still visible on discarded printouts. 10 p.m., clean the conference rooms, wiping away the residue of handshake deals that moved millions of dollars with no paper trail. Midnight, Vacuum the trading floor, where young millionaires made fortunes with the casual indifference of children playing video games. 2 a.m. Mop the lobby. His reflection multiplied endlessly in the polished granite that announced the Crane Empire to anyone who entered. By dawn, Harold would stand at the 40th floor window, watching the sun paint the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and amber. He would think about Maria, about the grandchildren they never had, about the small dreams that had been postponed until there was more money, more time, more certainty. The city spread below him like a promise he had never been wealthy enough to claim, its towers full of people chasing wealth that seemed to slip through their fingers like Lake Michigan sand. But in these quiet moments before the building filled with the urgency of commerce, Harold found a peace that Robert Crane's billions couldn't buy. He found it in work done well, in floors that gleamed like mirrors, in the satisfaction of maintaining order in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. His dignity wasn't something that could be purchased or traded on any exchange. It was earned through decades of showing up, of caring for spaces that others took for granted, of remaining kind in a building where kindness was often seen as weakness. Harold carried his lunch in a worn paper bag, usually a sandwich Maria had taught him to make, wrapped in wax paper, the way she'd learned from her grandmother. He ate alone in the basement break room, reading yesterday's Tribune while the building's elite dined on $1,000 meals in restaurants where the waitstaff made more in tips than Harold earned in a week. Yet there was something in Harold's contentment, in his quiet appreciation for simple things, that made him richer than men whose net worth appeared in Forbes magazine. The morning routine began with Harold's methodical inspection of every floor, every corner, every surface that would soon be touched by manicured hands and scrutinized by suspicious eyes. He moved like a guardian angel through corporate corridors, his presence so consistent it had become invisible, his dedication so reliable it was taken for granted. In a building worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Harold Washington was the one thing that couldn't be bought, sold, or traded. He was the soul of the place, the conscience that resided in its foundation, the moral center that its inhabitants had forgotten they needed. Harold's relationship with the building was intimate in a way that its owner could never understand. While Robert Crane saw square footage and potential returns on investment, Harold saw the subtle signs that revealed the building's health and the character of its occupants. He knew which pipes would freeze first in a Chicago winter, which elevators needed maintenance before they broke down, which windows leaked during spring thunderstorms that rolled in from Lake Michigan. Each morning at 5 a.m., Harold would enter through the service entrance on Franklin Street, his key card worn smooth from years of daily use. The building in darkness felt different than it did during business hours. More honest somehow, stripped of the pretense that daylight and expensive suits provided. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of air through ventilation systems and the distant hum of servers processing overnight trades in cryptocurrency markets that never slept. Harold's first stop was always the security office, where he'd check the overnight logs with Eddie Ramirez, the night security guard who'd become his closest friend in the building. Eddie was a former Marine who understood the dignity of service, who respected Harold's quiet competence, and never questioned why a man of obvious intelligence spent his nights pushing a mop cart through corporate hallways. "Morning, Harry," Eddie would say, sliding a cup of coffee across the desk. Always black, always strong, brewed in a machine that Harold had repaired himself when the company was unwilling to spend money on new equipment for the night shift. "Morning, Eddie. Anything I should know about?" Harold would ask, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who'd learned that the wrong comment to the wrong person could cost him his job. The logs usually told stories of minor dramas, executives working late to massage quarterly numbers, cleaning crews from other companies stealing office supplies, delivery drivers who'd had to wait hours for someone authorized to accept packages worth more than Harold's annual salary. But lately, there had been other entries, meetings that didn't appear on official calendars, visitors who bypassed the normal sign-in procedures, Phone calls that lasted until dawn while Harold worked around whispered conversations in multiple languages. Harold had developed an ability to read the emotional temperature of the building through subtle signs that others missed. Stress appeared in the number of crumpled papers in wastebaskets, in coffee stains on conference room tables that suggested sleepless nights, in the way elevator buttons were pushed with increasing urgency as quarterly reports approached. The building's marble floors reflected more than light. They reflected the mounting pressure of an empire built on increasingly precarious financial foundations. On the 37th floor, Harold maintained the offices of the accounting department, where Elizabeth Crane worked as the company's chief financial officer. Unlike her brother, Elizabeth treated Harold with the kind of respect that had become rare in the building. She remembered his wife's name, asked about his health, and always made sure he received a Christmas bonus that came from her personal account, rather than the corporate funds that her brother controlled with an iron fist. "Good morning, Harold," she would say when their paths crossed in hallways that smelled of expensive cologne and hidden desperation. "How are those grandnieces of Maria's doing in school?" Harold would smile, touched that she remembered details about his extended family, the daughters of Maria's sister, who had become the closest thing to grandchildren he would ever have. Elizabeth's office was always neat, her papers organized with the precision of someone who understood that in a building full of financial irregularities, documentation was survival. She worked late more often now, her desk lamp creating a small island of light in floors that had grown dark with suspicious activity. The building's basement contained Harold's domain, a maintenance area that most employees never saw but that kept their world functioning. Here, among industrial washers and cleaning supplies, Harold had created a small sanctuary, a desk made from an old door and 2 filing cabinets where he kept meticulous records of maintenance schedules, supply inventories, and observations that a smarter man might have recognized as evidence of crimes that could topple governments. Harold's notebooks, written in the careful handwriting of a man who'd never learned to type, contained details that federal prosecutors would have killed for. Dates when unusual amounts of cash arrived in unmarked briefcases, times when encrypted phone calls were made to offshore accounts, meetings between Robert Crane and men whose names appeared on FBI watch lists. Harold recorded these things not out of any investigative instinct, but simply because he'd always been a man who paid attention to details. The notebooks were locked in a filing cabinet that Harold had purchased with his own money, along with the combination lock that protected them. He told himself he was just keeping track of building operations, but somewhere in his careful mind, Harold knew he was documenting something larger, a pattern of corruption that stretched from Chicago's financial district to cryptocurrency exchanges in countries that didn't extradite their criminals. Harold's evening routine included a final walk through the executive floors, ensuring that sensitive documents were properly secured and that the building was ready for another day of commerce that grew more questionable with each passing month. It was during these walks that Harold had begun to notice the signs of an empire under pressure. The increasing number of documents fed through industrial shredders, the meetings that ran past midnight, the phone calls taken in languages that suggested business relationships with very dangerous people. The weight of what he observed had begun to press on Harold's shoulders like the Chicago winter wind that howled through the downtown canyon of towers. He was a man who believed in honest work and fair dealing, values that seemed increasingly foreign in a building where millions of dollars moved through accounts faster than Harold could clean the offices where the deals were made. Yet he remained silent, loyal to an employer who saw him as little more than a piece of furniture, continuing to guard secrets that could destroy the very people who refused to acknowledge his humanity. But secrets, like dust, have a way of accumulating in corners where people think no one is looking. And Harold Washington, invisible as he'd become, was always looking, always listening, always there when powerful people forgot that even janitors have eyes, ears, and most dangerously of all, perfect memories for the details that matter most. It was on a Tuesday evening in November when Harold's invisible world collided with Robert Crane's empire of arrogance. The autumn wind was rattling the windows of the 40th floor when Elizabeth Crane discovered that her grandmother's watch was missing from her desk drawer. The watch, a 1920s Cartier timepiece worth more than most people made in 5 years, had been left to Elizabeth by a woman who'd survived the Depression by understanding the value of things that couldn't be printed by federal banks or manipulated by stock markets. The discovery sent ripples of panic through the executive floors that Harold felt in the way people walked, the sharpness of voices echoing through corridors, the sudden appearance of security personnel who weren't part of Eddie Ramirez's regular team. Harold was polishing the marble floors of the 40th floor lobby when Elizabeth emerged from her office, her face pale with the kind of distress that money couldn't solve. "Harold," she said, her voice tight with emotion, "have you seen anyone unusual up here today? Anyone who might have been in my office?" Harold paused in his work, reading the tension in her posture. The way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "No, Miss Elizabeth, just the regular cleaning crew and the usual executives. Is something wrong?" Before Elizabeth could answer, her brother's voice cut through the expensive silence like a blade. "What's going on here?" Robert Crane stepped out of the elevator with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to solving problems by throwing money or threats at them. His suit probably cost more than Harold made in 3 months, his watch, ironically, worth enough to buy a house in Harold's neighborhood. "My grandmother's watch is missing," Elizabeth explained, her voice steady despite the emotion Harold could see in her eyes. "The one she left me in her will. It was in my desk drawer this morning, locked, and now it's gone." Robert's gaze swept the area like a security camera, cold and calculating. When his eyes landed on Harold, they narrowed with the kind of suspicion that rich men develop toward anyone who works with their hands. "Who has access to this floor after hours?" "The cleaning crew, maintenance staff, security, and senior executives," Elizabeth replied, but Harold could feel the weight of Robert's stare settling on him like a physical presence. "When did you last see it?" Robert demanded, his attention still fixed on Harold as though the question were directed at him rather than his sister. "This morning, around 9. I opened the drawer to get a pen and I saw it there. It was definitely there." Harold continued his work, his movements careful and measured, even as he felt the atmosphere in the lobby shift from concern to accusation. He'd seen this before, the way suspicion flowed downward in corporate hierarchies, always settling on the people who had the least power to defend themselves. "Harold," Robert's voice carried the sharp edge of authority mixed with barely concealed contempt. "You were up here today, weren't you?" "Yes, sir. Same as every day. Cleaned the offices, emptied the trash, polished the floors." Harold's voice remained steady, but inside he felt the familiar tight knot that formed in his stomach whenever powerful people decided he was guilty of something. "And you didn't notice anything unusual? Anyone who didn't belong here?" "No, sir. Just the usual people." Harold met Robert's gaze directly, not in challenge, but with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing to hide. But Robert Crane was not a man who dealt in subtlety or patience. His empire was built on quick decisions and decisive action, on the ability to eliminate problems before they could threaten his carefully constructed world of cryptocurrency investments and offshore accounts. Harold, standing there with his mop and his worn uniform, represented everything that Robert had never had to be: powerless, dependent, vulnerable. "Elizabeth, call security. I want the building sealed and everyone on this floor searched." Robert's voice carried the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "Someone took that watch, and I intend to find out who." The next hour unfolded like a nightmare, choreographed by paranoia and prejudice. Security guards who didn't know Harold, who saw only an elderly black man with cleaning supplies, treated him like a suspect in a crime that hadn't even been proven. His cart was searched, his pockets emptied, his dignity stripped away in front of people who had watched him work with dedication for 17 years. Harold submitted to the search with the quiet endurance of a man who'd lived through worse humiliations. but Elizabeth Crane watched with growing horror as her brother transformed from a demanding executive into something uglier, a man whose wealth had insulated him from the basic human decency that his sister still possessed. "Robert, this is enough," Elizabeth finally said, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Harold has worked here for almost 2 decades. He's never stolen so much as a paperclip." But her brother was beyond reason now, his suspicion feeding on itself like a fire-consuming oxygen. That's exactly why he'd be perfect for this. Who would suspect the loyal janitor? Someone who knows our schedules, our routines, someone who has access to everything while we're all at home sleeping. The search turned up nothing, because there was nothing to find. Harold's locker contained a spare uniform, his lunch, and a photograph of Maria that he kept there to remind him why he worked so hard. His cart held cleaning supplies and the tools of his trade, but no mysterious Cartier watch worth more than his life savings. Yet the absence of evidence didn't satisfy Robert Crane. It seemed to enrage him further. In his world, guilt was presumed, and innocence had to be purchased with lawyers and political connections that Harold could never afford. Standing in his own building, surrounded by the symbols of his wealth and power, Robert made a decision that would haunt him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. "You're fired," he announced, his voice echoing off marble floors that Harold had polished to mirror brightness for 17 years. "Clear out your locker and get out. Security will escort you from the building." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whisper of ventilation systems that Harold had maintained through countless Chicago winters and summers. Elizabeth's face went white with shock, but she knew her brother well enough to understand that arguing would only make things worse for Harold. Harold nodded slowly, with the dignity of a man who'd expected this moment, even as he'd hoped it would never come. "I understand, sir." His voice was steady, but those who knew him could hear the decades of accumulated hurt beneath the calm surface. As Harold cleaned out his locker for the last time, his hands moved with automatic precision born of years of routine. But beneath the cleaning supplies and spare uniforms, wrapped in an old towel that Maria had embroidered with his initials, Harold's fingers found something that Robert Crane's search hadn't discovered. Not because it was hidden, but because powerful men rarely looked closely at things that belonged to people they considered unimportant. It was a key, brass and worn smooth by handling, attached to a keychain that Maria had given him on their 20th wedding anniversary. The key opened a storage room in the building's basement, a room that Harold had been asked to clean out years ago when the previous owner had died. But Harold, with his careful attention to detail and his respect for other people's possessions, had preserved everything he'd found there, including documents that revealed the true foundation of the Crane financial empire. Walking out of the building for the last time, Harold felt the weight of that key against his leg, and for the first time in his life, he wondered if being invisible might finally become an advantage rather than a burden. The Chicago wind was cold against his face as he stepped onto the sidewalk, but inside his chest, something that had been quiet for 17 years was beginning to stir. Not anger, but something more dangerous to men like Robert Crane. The patient determination of someone who had finally realized that silence wasn't always golden, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon against arrogance was simple, unadorned truth. Chicago in December was particularly cruel that year, as if the city itself was mourning Harold's dismissal from the building where he'd spent nearly 2 decades of his life. The wind that swept off Lake Michigan carried more than cold. It carried the sharp bite of injustice that seemed to follow Harold through the streets of downtown, past the glittering towers where men like Robert Crane made fortunes while good people lost their dignity for crimes they didn't commit. Harold's severance package consisted of 2 weeks' pay, and the cruel irony that 17 years of loyal service could be erased by one man's suspicion and prejudice. He deposited the final check at the currency exchange on Ashland Avenue, watching the numbers in his worn bank book, numbers that no longer seemed adequate for a future that had arrived decades earlier than he'd planned. But Harold Washington was not a man who dwelt on bitterness, even when bitterness would have been justified. Instead, he spent his days walking through Pilsen, visiting the library on 18th Street, drinking coffee at the Mexican bakery where the owner, Mrs. Guerrero, had known Maria and still asked about her with the gentle persistence of someone who refused to let grief erase love. "You look tired, Harold," Mrs. Guerrero would say, sliding an extra sweet roll onto his plate without charging for it. "Are you eating enough?" Maria, she would not want you to forget to eat. These small kindnesses reminded Harold that the world contained more than Robert Crane's cold calculation and corporate indifference. In Pilsen, Harold was not invisible. He was a neighbor, a regular customer, a man whose presence mattered to people who measured wealth in different currency than stock options and cryptocurrency investments. It was during these quiet December days that Harold began to make trips to the basement storage room that his key still opened. The building's new management, hired to replace Harold's institutional knowledge with cheaper labor, had never bothered to change the locks on doors they didn't think mattered. Harold's access was inadvertent but legal. His key had never been officially returned, and the storage room wasn't on any security checklist that mattered to men who counted profits in millions. The room was exactly as Harold had left it years ago, when he'd carefully cataloged and preserved the belongings of Jonathan Mitchell, the building's previous owner. Mitchell had been an old-school Chicago businessman who'd built his fortune on manufacturing and real estate, but who died suddenly of a heart attack before he could transfer ownership of certain sensitive documents to his intended heirs. Among those documents, preserved in bankers' boxes and protected by Harold's instinctive respect for other people's property, was Mitchell's private correspondence with federal investigators who had been building a case against early cryptocurrency money laundering operations. The letters, typed on letterhead from the FBI's Economic Crimes Division, detailed Mitchell's cooperation in an investigation that had stalled after his death, an investigation that had been quietly resumed now that cryptocurrency had become the preferred method for moving money without government oversight. Harold read these documents with growing understanding, his careful mind connecting patterns that investigators with advanced degrees had missed. The dates in Mitchell's correspondence aligned perfectly with Harold's own observations of unusual activity in the Crane building. Late-night meetings that Harold had noted in his maintenance logs corresponded with cryptocurrency transfers that Mitchell had documented as part of his cooperation with federal authorities. More damaging still were Mitchell's meticulous records of cash payments made to city officials, state politicians, and federal appointees who had quietly smoothed the regulatory path for Crane's financial operations. These weren't the kind of campaign contributions that appeared on public disclosure forms. They were direct payments for specific favors, documented with the precision of a man who understood that power without proof was just another form of vulnerability. But the most devastating document in Mitchell's collection was a handwritten letter, never sent, addressed to his own daughter. In it, Mitchell confessed his regret at selling his building to Robert Crane, describing meetings where Crane had bragged about laundering money for organizations that Mitchell's generation had fought against in foreign wars. The letter was dated just 3 days before Mitchell's fatal heart attack, and reading it, Harold felt the weight of a dying man's conscience transferred across years of silence to his own careful hands. Harold spent hours in that storage room, cross-referencing Mitchell's documents with his own observations, building a picture of corruption that stretched from Chicago's financial district to cryptocurrency exchanges in countries that had become havens for money that governments couldn't track. The pattern was clear to anyone with patience and attention to detail, qualities that Harold possessed in abundance and that men like Robert Crane had never needed to develop. As Chicago winter tightened its grip on the city, Harold began to make copies of the most important documents, using the library's photocopying machine and paying with coins that added up to more than he could easily afford. But this wasn't about money anymore. It was about something that Harold had spent his life protecting, something that Robert Crane's wealth couldn't purchase or destroy: the truth. The truth was that Robert Crane's empire was built on financial crimes that would have sent a poor man to federal prison for life. The truth was that cryptocurrency investments that appeared legitimate on paper were actually sophisticated schemes to launder money for organizations that funded terrorism, drug trafficking, and worse. The truth was that politicians who campaigned on law and order platforms had received briefcases full of cash in exchange for appointments that gutted financial oversight. And the truth, most importantly, was that Elizabeth Crane's missing watch had never been stolen by Harold Washington. It had been pawned by Robert himself, who needed quick cash for a cryptocurrency payment that couldn't be traced through normal banking channels. Harold had found the pawn ticket, along with others, in Jonathan Mitchell's effects, evidence that Crane had been using his sister's jewelry as collateral for illegal transactions for years. Harold sat in that storage room on Christmas Eve, surrounded by documents that could destroy one of Chicago's most powerful men, and felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like snow accumulating on the city streets above. He could take this evidence to the FBI, to the newspapers, to the federal prosecutors who had been building cases against cryptocurrency money launderers. He could clear his own name and send Robert Crane to the kind of prison where wealth provided no protection from justice. But Harold was not a vengeful man, and vengeance was not what the documents in his hands represented. They represented something more valuable and more dangerous, the truth that powerful men feared most, the truth that their empires were built on foundations of sand and crime, the truth that justice delayed was not justice denied if the right person held the right evidence at the right moment. Harold locked the storage room and walked home through snow that muffled the sounds of a city celebrating Christmas. In his small apartment in Pilsen, he placed the copied documents in a manila envelope and wrote on the outside, in his careful handwriting, "For Elizabeth Crane, when the time comes." The truth could wait a little longer. Harold had spent 17 years learning patience, and he understood that the most powerful weapon against arrogance was not immediate action, but the perfect timing that came from watching, waiting, and trusting that justice had its own schedule, a schedule that didn't depend on the stock market, cryptocurrency prices, or the impatience of men who measured everything in quarterly profits. Outside his window, Chicago slept under a blanket of white, and Harold Washington, the invisible janitor who had remembered everything, finally allowed himself to smile. The new year brought changes to the Crane Financial Building that even its wealthy tenants couldn't ignore. The professional cleaning service that replaced Harold was efficient but soulless, missing the institutional knowledge that Harold had carried in his careful memory for 17 years. Floors that had gleamed like mirrors under Harold's care now showed streaks and water spots. Executive bathrooms ran out of supplies. The building's mechanical systems, no longer maintained by someone who understood their subtle rhythms, began to fail with increasing frequency. More troubling for Robert Crane was the reality that replacing Harold's expertise required 3 different service contracts, each more expensive than Harold's entire annual salary had been. The new cleaning service charged premium rates for after-hours work. The maintenance company demanded expensive diagnostic fees for problems that Harold had prevented through preventive care. The security company insisted on upgraded systems to monitor areas that Harold had watched with nothing more than observant eyes and institutional memory. But these visible problems were symptoms of larger issues that Robert's arrogance prevented him from recognizing. Harold's dismissal had been witnessed by other longtime employees who understood exactly what had happened: a good man's sacrifice to a rich man's prejudice and paranoia. The building's atmosphere changed, becoming tense and suspicious, as workers who had previously taken pride in their service began to question the character of their employer. Elizabeth Crane felt this shift most acutely. As the company's chief financial officer, she worked closely with employees at every level, and she could sense the erosion of trust that her brother's actions had caused. The security guards, the administrative assistants, the maintenance staff All had known Harold, respected him, and watched him escorted from the building like a common criminal based on nothing more than suspicion. "Robert, we need to talk," Elizabeth said one snowy morning in January, standing in her brother's office with the kind of determination that their father would have recognized. "The Harold situation has created problems beyond what you might realize." Robert was examining cryptocurrency charts on multiple monitors, watching numbers fluctuate in markets that never closed, pursuing profits that required increasingly complex international transactions. "What Harold situation? I dealt with that months ago." "You destroyed a man's reputation based on suspicion, not evidence. And people noticed. Our employees, our clients, our community partners, they're asking questions about our judgment, our character." Robert's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Character doesn't appear on quarterly earnings reports, Elizabeth. Harold Washington was a security risk, and I eliminated the risk. That's what leaders do." But leadership, Elizabeth was beginning to understand, required more than the ability to fire people who couldn't defend themselves. Her brother's empire, built on cryptocurrency speculation and offshore financial maneuvering, was showing signs of stress that went beyond temporary market fluctuations. Federal investigators were asking questions about transaction patterns that seemed designed to avoid banking oversight. International partners were demanding additional security for deals that skirted the edges of legal compliance. Most concerning were the late-night phone calls that Elizabeth overheard, conversations in which her brother discussed moving assets to cryptocurrency wallets that existed in countries without extradition treaties. The family fortune, built over 3 generations through legitimate business practices, was being transformed into something that required constant vigilance, legal protection, and the kind of secrecy that suggested criminal liability. Harold, meanwhile, had found work as a security guard for a small office building in Logan Square, a position that paid less than half his previous salary, but offered something more valuable: respect from an employer who appreciated reliability and integrity. The building's owner, Maria Santos, was a first-generation immigrant who had built her real estate business through hard work and honest dealing, values that she recognized and rewarded in her employees. "Harold, you're overqualified for this position," Maria had said during his interview, reading through references that praised his dedication and attention to detail. "Why do you want to work here when you could probably find something that pays better?" Harold's answer revealed the dignity that 17 years of corporate invisibility hadn't diminished. "Mrs. Santos, I've learned that working for good people is worth more than working for rich people. I'd rather be respected than just tolerated." The Logan Square building was smaller, quieter, and filled with tenants who ran small businesses, accounting firms, legal offices, consulting services, operated by people who understood the value of employees who took pride in their work. Harold's presence was immediately felt and appreciated. Floors gleamed, mechanical problems were identified and resolved before they became expensive repairs, and the building's security improved simply because someone was finally paying careful attention to details that mattered. But Harold's new position also gave him something he'd never had at the Crane building: time. Time to think, to plan, and to carefully consider how best to use the information he'd discovered in Jonathan Mitchell's storage room. Harold was not impulsive by nature, and he understood that the documents in his possession were powerful enough to destroy lives, a responsibility that required wisdom, not anger. Through the long Chicago winter, Harold researched federal procedures for reporting financial crimes, learning how corruption cases were built and prosecuted. He visited the library, read legal websites, and educated himself about cryptocurrency regulations that most law enforcement agencies were still struggling to understand. Harold's careful mind, trained by decades of attention to detail, proved remarkably adept at understanding complex financial crimes that investigators with law degrees sometimes missed. By March, when the worst of Chicago's winter had passed, Harold had compiled a comprehensive case that connected Robert Crane's cryptocurrency investments to money laundering operations that spanned 3 continents. The evidence was overwhelming, professionally organized, and documented with the same meticulous care that Harold had once applied to maintaining marble floors in executive washrooms. But Harold's plan required one final element: perfect timing. He had learned from watching powerful men that timing was everything, the difference between justice and mere revenge, between meaningful change and temporary embarrassment. Harold was patient enough to wait for the moment when truth would have maximum impact, when Robert Crane's arrogance would create the perfect opportunity for his own downfall. That opportunity came in the form of Elizabeth Crane's growing courage and her increasing willingness to confront the moral compromises that her brother's business practices required. As the company's CFO, Elizabeth had access to financial records that confirmed her worst suspicions about the family business. She was beginning to understand that her brother's wealth wasn't just built on aggressive investment strategies, it was built on crimes that she could no longer pretend to ignore. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in April when Harold was finishing his rounds at the Logan Square building. Elizabeth's voice was tense with emotion and determination that Harold recognized from their years of respectful interaction. "Harold, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you take my grandmother's watch?" Harold's answer came without hesitation, delivered in the same steady voice that Elizabeth remembered from countless mornings when he'd wished her well and asked about her family. "No, Miss Elizabeth, I've never stolen anything in my life, and I never would." The silence that followed was profound, filled with implications that both understood but neither stated directly. Elizabeth was finally ready to hear the truth, and Harold was finally ready to share it. "I think we need to meet," Elizabeth said quietly. "There are things I've discovered about Robert's business practices, things that I can't ignore anymore, and I think you might know more about what's been happening in our building than anyone realizes." Harold agreed to meet the following evening at a small cafe in Pilsen, neutral ground where two people from different worlds could discuss truths that would change both their lives forever. As he hung up the phone, Harold felt the key in his pocket, the weight of documents that could restore his reputation and reveal crimes that demanded justice. The time for silence was ending, and Harold Washington, the invisible man who had remembered everything, was finally ready to be seen. The cafe on 18th Street was the kind of place where neighborhoods came together over strong coffee and honest conversation, where Maria had once met Harold for lunch during the early years of their marriage. Harold arrived first, choosing a corner table where he could see the street and where their conversation wouldn't be overheard by curious ears that might misunderstand the gravity of what was about to unfold. Elizabeth entered quietly, her professional confidence tempered by the nervousness of someone about to cross a line from which there could be no return. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, having exchanged her executive armor for clothes that wouldn't attract attention in a neighborhood where her family name appeared on very few charitable donation lists. "Thank you for coming," she said, settling into the chair across from Harold with the careful dignity of someone who'd finally decided that doing the right thing was more important than maintaining family loyalty. Harold nodded, studying her face and recognizing something he'd hoped to see for years: the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. "Miss Elizabeth, before we start, I want you to know that whatever we discuss here, my goal isn't to hurt your family. It's to set things right." For the next 2 hours, Harold and Elizabeth shared information that painted a devastating picture of Robert Crane's financial empire. Elizabeth revealed cryptocurrency transactions that couldn't be explained through legitimate business activities, payments to offshore accounts that corresponded with political favors, and most damning of all, pawn tickets for family jewelry that Robert had secretly used as collateral for illegal transactions. "He's been selling our grandmother's jewelry for years," Elizabeth said, her voice tight with anger and betrayal. "Pieces that were supposed to stay in the family, that represented our history, our values. He pawned them to raise cash for deals that he couldn't finance through normal banking channels." Harold reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope, worn smooth by handling, but containing documents that could end Robert's criminal career and restore Harold's reputation. "Miss Elizabeth, there's something I need to show you. Something I found when I was cleaning out storage rooms that your brother never bothered to inventory." The documents Harold spread across the cafe table told a story that was worse than Elizabeth's darkest suspicions. Jonathan Mitchell's correspondence with federal investigators revealed that Robert had essentially purchased the building to acquire Mitchell's cryptocurrency laundering operation, transforming a legitimate family business into a front for international money laundering that funded organizations no decent person would support. "My God," Elizabeth whispered, reading letters that detailed her brother's bragging about transactions that violated every principle their family had once represented. "He's not just stealing from the family. He's betraying everything our grandfather built, everything our father believed in." Harold watched Elizabeth process the implications of what she was reading, understanding that she was experiencing the same moral awakening that had driven him to preserve these documents despite the personal risk. "Miss Elizabeth, I've been carrying this knowledge for months, waiting for the right time to reveal it. I think that time is now." Elizabeth looked up from the documents, her eyes bright with tears, but her voice steady with resolve. "Harold, I owe you an apology that's months overdue. I knew you didn't take that watch. I should have defended you, should have stood up to Robert when he destroyed your reputation based on nothing but his own paranoia and prejudice." "You don't owe me any apologies," Harold replied gently. "You weren't the one who accused me, and you weren't in a position to stop what happened. But you are in a position to help me make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Their plan was simple in outline, but complex in execution. Elizabeth would use her access as CFO to copy additional financial records that corroborated Mitchell's evidence. Harold would provide the historical documentation that proved Robert's crimes weren't recent mistakes, but part of a long-term pattern of criminal behavior. Together, they would present a case to federal investigators that was too comprehensive and well-documented to ignore or dismiss. But the plan required timing that balanced justice with safety. Robert Crane was not just a criminal. He was a dangerous criminal with connections to organizations that solved problems through violence rather than litigation. Elizabeth and Harold both understood that once they revealed what they knew, they would need protection from people who viewed federal prison as preferable to witnesses who could testify about international money laundering operations. "There's something else," Elizabeth said as they prepared to leave the cafe. "The FBI has been asking questions about our cryptocurrency transactions. Small questions, casual inquiries, but the kind that suggest they're building a case and looking for someone with inside knowledge to help them understand Robert's operations." Harold nodded slowly, understanding the implications. "Miss Elizabeth, those federal agents don't need someone with inside knowledge. They need someone with outside perspective, someone who's been watching and listening without being part of the criminal enterprise. They need someone like me." As they walked out into the April evening, Harold felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like the Chicago wind that had carried so many difficult moments in his life. But this time, the weight felt different, not like a burden, but like responsibility accepted by someone who finally understood that justice required more than patience. It required courage. "Tomorrow I'm calling the FBI," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying the determination of someone who'd finally chosen principle over family loyalty. "Will you meet with them? Will you help me make sure Robert faces consequences for what he's done?" Harold's answer came without hesitation, delivered in the same steady voice that had carried him through 17 years of invisible service and months of difficult patience. "Miss Elizabeth, I've been ready to tell the truth for longer than you might imagine. The question isn't whether I'll help. It's whether justice is finally ready to listen." That night, Harold sat in his small apartment in Pilsen, touching the photograph of Maria that still graced his nightstand, feeling her presence in a decision that she would have understood and supported. Maria had always believed that doing the right thing was more important than doing the easy thing, and tomorrow Harold would finally have the chance to prove that her faith in his character had been justified. The truth was patient, but it was also persistent. And Harold Washington, the man who had remembered everything while remaining invisible, was finally ready to step into the light and reveal what powerful people did when they thought no one was watching. The FBI field office on West Roosevelt Road was not the kind of building where Harold had expected to find himself, but then again, nothing about the last 6 months had followed any pattern he might have anticipated. The federal agents who met with Harold and Elizabeth were younger than he'd imagined, dressed casually, but carrying themselves with the quiet authority of people who understood that financial crimes could be more devastating than violence and infinitely more difficult to prosecute. Special Agent Sarah Chen specialized in cryptocurrency investigations that crossed international boundaries, while Agent Marcus Rodriguez focused on corruption cases involving public officials and regulated industries. Together, they represented the new generation of federal investigators who understood that modern criminal enterprises use technology and financial innovation to commit traditional crimes of fraud, bribery, and money laundering. "Mr. Washington," Agent Chen began, her voice carrying respect that Harold hadn't heard from law enforcement in decades. "We understand you have information about Robert Crane's business operations that might help us understand some transaction patterns we've been investigating." Harold had prepared for this meeting with the same careful attention to detail that he'd once applied to maintaining corporate offices. His documentation was organized chronologically, cross-referenced with supporting evidence, and presented with the clarity of someone who understood that credibility was earned through precision, not emotion. "Agents Chen and Rodriguez," Harold replied, opening the first of several folders he'd brought to the meeting. "I've been watching Robert Crane's operations for 17 years. I've seen things, heard things, and documented things that I believe will help you understand not just what he's been doing, but how he's been doing it." For the next 4 hours, Harold walked the federal agents through a criminal enterprise that was more sophisticated and more extensive than their investigation had revealed. Harold's maintenance logs, which he'd kept meticulously throughout his employment, provided dates and times for meetings that corresponded perfectly with cryptocurrency transactions that the FBI had been trying to trace through international banking systems. "Mr. Washington, these observations are incredibly detailed," Agent Rodriguez observed, studying notations that Harold had made about visitors, phone calls, and meetings that had seemed suspicious at the time, but were now clearly part of a criminal pattern. "How were you able to document all of this without anyone noticing?" Harold's smile was gentle but tinged with the sadness of someone who understood exactly why his observations had gone unnoticed. "Agent Rodriguez, I was invisible to people like Robert Crane. They saw me as part of the building's infrastructure, no more capable of understanding their conversations than the elevator or the air conditioning system. They forgot that janitors have eyes, ears, and memories." Elizabeth supplemented Harold's observations with financial records that transformed suspicion into evidence suitable for federal prosecution. As CFO, she had access to account statements, transaction records, and correspondence that revealed the full scope of her brother's criminal operations. Her decision to cooperate with federal investigators required personal courage that Harold deeply respected, particularly given the financial and social consequences she would face when Robert's empire collapsed. "Ms. Crane," Agent Chen said, reviewing bank statements that showed millions of dollars moving through accounts in countries that didn't share financial information with American authorities, "we appreciate your cooperation, but we need you to understand that your brother's organization has connections to some very dangerous people who don't hesitate to eliminate threats to their operations." Elizabeth's response revealed the moral strength that Harold had always sensed beneath her professional exterior, the same strength that had made her the only member of the Crane family who treated service employees with basic human dignity. "Agent Chen, my brother stopped being my family the moment he decided to build his fortune on activities that fund terrorism and human trafficking. I'm more afraid of what happens if we don't stop him then what happens if we do? The meeting concluded with agreements that would provide protection for both Harold and Elizabeth while federal investigators built their case. Harold would continue his normal work routine while wearing recording equipment that would document any attempts by Robert or his associates to intimidate or threaten him. Elizabeth would remain in her CFO position, providing real-time intelligence about Robert's operations, while investigators traced the international connections that made his crimes so difficult to prosecute. But the most important outcome of the meeting was Harold's recognition that his decades of careful observation had finally found their purpose. Federal investigators who'd spent months trying to understand Robert's operations could now see the patterns that Harold's patient documentation had revealed, patterns that transformed scattered evidence into a comprehensive case that could withstand the expensive legal challenges that men like Robert Crane could mount. Walking out of the federal building that afternoon, Harold felt something he hadn't experienced since Maria's death, a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own immediate needs. His cooperation with federal investigators wasn't just about clearing his reputation or seeking justice for his wrongful dismissal. It was about ensuring that people who committed crimes against society faced consequences regardless of their wealth or political connections. That evening, Harold called Mrs. Santos, the owner of the building where he now worked as a security guard, to inform her that he might need to take time off for legal proceedings that could stretch for months. Her response revealed the respect that Harold had earned through months of reliable, honest service, respect that Robert Crane had never offered despite 17 years of loyal employment. "Harold, you take whatever time you need," Mrs. Santos said, her voice warm with the affection of someone who recognized integrity when she saw it. "Your job will be here when you're ready to come back, and if anyone asks questions about your character, they can talk to me personally." These small kindnesses reminded Harold that the world contained more good people than bad, more justice than injustice, more hope than despair. Robert Crane's wealth and arrogance had created the illusion that power belonged only to people without conscience, but Harold's cooperation with federal investigators was helping to restore a balance that he'd begun to fear was permanently lost. That night, Harold sat in his small apartment, preparing for what might be months of testimony, depositions, and court appearances that would finally allow him to tell his story publicly. The truth that he'd carried silently for so long was about to become part of the public record, documented in federal court proceedings that would ensure Robert Crane's crimes were exposed, regardless of his attempts to use wealth and influence to escape justice. Harold touched Maria's photograph, feeling her presence in a decision that she would have understood and supported. Tomorrow, he would begin cooperating with federal investigators in earnest, wearing recording equipment, documenting meetings, and providing the kind of detailed testimony that could send Robert Crane to federal prison for decades. The Invisible Man was about to become the most important witness in a case that would prove, once and for all, that justice didn't depend on wealth, political connections, or social status. It depended on people like Harold Washington, who remembered everything and refused to let powerful men escape the consequences of their crimes. The investigation that followed moved with the deliberate pace of federal justice, but Harold's role in it transformed him from victim to victor in ways that went far beyond legal vindication. As news of the Crane investigation became public, Harold found himself receiving apologies from former colleagues who'd witnessed his dismissal, but hadn't possessed the courage to speak up when it mattered. Eddie Ramirez, the security guard who'd shared morning coffee with Harold for years, was among the first to reach out. "Harry, man, I should have said something when Crane fired you. I knew you didn't take that watch, but I was scared of losing my job. I'm sorry." These conversations revealed something that Harold had never fully understood. His dismissal had affected more people than just himself. Other employees had watched a good man destroyed by a rich man's prejudice, and their silence had cost them sleep, respect, and the peace of mind that came from standing up for what was right when it mattered most. The federal investigation also revealed the true scope of Robert's crimes, which extended far beyond the money laundering and political corruption that Harold had documented. Robert's cryptocurrency operations were connected to international networks that funded human trafficking, terrorism, and drug cartels that destabilized entire regions. Money that appeared in legitimate investment portfolios was actually the proceeds of activities that destroyed lives and communities across multiple continents. Harold's testimony to federal grand juries was devastating in its detail and credibility. His careful documentation, his institutional memory, and his obvious integrity made him the kind of witness that defense attorneys couldn't discredit or dismiss. When Harold testified about conversations he'd overheard, meetings he'd observed, and patterns he'd noticed, federal prosecutors knew they had evidence that could withstand the most expensive legal challenges. But the most significant vindication came from an unexpected source, Robert Crane himself. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of spending the rest of his life in federal prison, Robert began cooperating with investigators in hopes of reducing his sentence. His cooperation included a full confession about the missing watch that had cost Harold his job and reputation. "I pawned Elizabeth's watch to raise cash for a cryptocurrency transaction that had to be completed immediately," Robert admitted during a recorded interview that federal agents shared with Harold and Elizabeth. "I blamed Washington because I needed someone to take responsibility, and I knew he couldn't defend himself against someone with my resources and connections." The confession was both vindication and tragedy. Vindication for Harold, but tragedy for Elizabeth, who finally heard her brother admit that he'd destroyed a good man's life simply because he could. The watch had never been stolen. It had been pawned by someone who viewed family heirlooms as collateral for criminal transactions and who'd sacrificed Harold's reputation to hide his own crimes. Federal sentencing guidelines for Robert's crimes suggested decades in prison, but Harold's involvement in the case ensured that justice would be both comprehensive and meaningful. Harold's victim impact statement, read at Robert's sentencing hearing, became part of the public record in a case that demonstrated how financial crimes affected real people in devastating ways. "Your Honor," Harold said, standing before the federal judge who would determine Robert Crane's sentence, "I don't want revenge against Mr. Crane. I want him to understand that the people he considered invisible are human beings with dignity, families, and lives that matter just as much as his own. I want him to serve his sentence knowing that justice doesn't depend on wealth or power. It depends on truth, and truth always finds a way to surface." Robert Crane was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the impact they'd had on victims like Harold. Elizabeth, who'd cooperated fully with investigators despite the personal cost, avoided prosecution but lost most of the family fortune to asset forfeiture proceedings that traced nearly everything back to criminal proceeds. Harold's vindication was complete, but more importantly, it was public. News coverage of the case featured Harold prominently, describing him as a hero whose courage and integrity had exposed crimes that law enforcement agencies had been struggling to understand and prosecute. The man who'd been invisible for 17 years was suddenly visible in the best possible way. As someone who'd chosen justice over safety, truth over silence. The building where Harold had worked for 17 years was eventually sold to pay legal judgments against the Crane organization. Elizabeth used her remaining assets to establish a foundation that provided legal assistance to service employees who faced workplace discrimination and wrongful termination. The foundation's first client was recommended by Harold, a young maintenance worker who'd been fired for reporting safety violations that his supervisor wanted to ignore. Harold returned to his position at Maria Santos's building in Logan Square, but his role had expanded beyond security guard to include consulting work for other property owners who'd learned about his expertise through news coverage of the Crane case. His reputation for integrity and attention to detail made him highly sought after by employers who understood that good people were their most valuable assets. More importantly, Harold's story inspired other service employees to speak up about wrongdoing they witnessed in their workplaces. His cooperation with federal investigators had demonstrated that justice was possible even when it required confronting people with enormous wealth and power, and that ordinary people possessed the ability to hold extraordinary criminals accountable for their actions. On quiet evenings in his apartment in Pilsen, Harold would sit with Maria's photograph and reflect on a life that had finally found its purpose. He'd spent 17 years being invisible, but those years had prepared him for the moment when visibility mattered most, when his testimony could ensure that a dangerous criminal faced justice, and when his courage could inspire others to believe that truth was more powerful than money. Harold Washington, the man who remembered everything, had finally been seen. And in being seen, he'd helped others understand that dignity didn't require wealth, that wisdom didn't require education, and that justice didn't depend on social status. It depended on good people who refused to remain silent when silence served evil more than truth. 2 years after Robert Crane's sentencing, Harold received an invitation that symbolized how completely his life had been transformed by his decision to cooperate with federal investigators. The Chicago Urban League, recognizing his contribution to exposing financial crimes that had affected communities across the city, invited him to receive their Community Service Award at their annual dinner honoring local heroes. The event was held at the Palmer House Hilton, the same hotel where Robert Crane had once entertained political figures and business associates whose campaigns and policies he'd purchased with money laundered through cryptocurrency accounts. Harold stood at the podium where corrupt officials had once promised favorable treatment in exchange for briefcases full of cash. But now he was speaking about values that money couldn't buy: integrity, courage, and the quiet dignity of honest work. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harold said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned respect through character rather than wealth, "I didn't set out to become a hero. I was just a janitor who paid attention to what was happening around him, who remembered what he saw, and who finally found the courage to speak up when speaking up could make a difference." In the audience, Elizabeth Crane listened with tears in her eyes as Harold described the importance of treating every person with dignity, regardless of their job title, social status, or economic circumstances. Elizabeth had used her remaining resources to fund programs that helped service employees pursue education and career advancement, but she knew that no amount of charitable giving could fully repair the damage her brother had caused to people like Harold. After the ceremony, Elizabeth approached Harold with the humility of someone who'd learned that moral authority couldn't be inherited or purchased. It had to be earned through actions that demonstrated respect for human dignity. "Harold, I know I said this before, but I need to say it again. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what Robert did to you, and I'm sorry I didn't find the courage to stop it when it happened." Harold's response reflected the grace that had carried him through decades of disrespect and months of federal investigations that could have destroyed his faith in justice. "Miss Elizabeth, you found your courage when it mattered most. You helped put a dangerous criminal in prison, and you've used your resources to help people like me. That's what matters now." The foundation that Elizabeth had established with Harold's guidance had grown into a significant force for workplace justice, providing legal representation for service employees who faced discrimination, wrongful termination, and wage theft. Harold served on the foundation's board of directors, bringing institutional knowledge and moral authority that helped ensure resources reached the people who needed them most. Harold's consulting work had also expanded beyond security services to include workplace safety assessments and employee relations consulting for organizations that wanted to build cultures of respect and dignity. His reputation for integrity and his understanding of how organizations functioned from the ground up made him valuable to employers who understood that treating employees well was both morally right and economically beneficial. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. Service employees across Chicago who'd heard Harold's story and drawn inspiration from his example. Janitors, security guards, maintenance workers, and cleaning staff began reaching out to Harold for advice about reporting workplace violations, seeking justice for discrimination, and finding the courage to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. Harold's small apartment in Pilsen became an informal counseling center where people who felt invisible could find support from someone who understood their experiences and had proof that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible. Harold never charged for this guidance, viewing it as part of his responsibility to use his experience to help others find their own courage. One evening, as Harold was preparing for bed after a day that had included testifying in another federal case involving financial crimes, he received a phone call that brought his story full circle. The caller was a young janitor working in a downtown office building, someone who'd witnessed suspicious activities but was afraid to report them because he feared losing his job. "Mr. Washington, my name is Carlos Mendoza, and I work nights cleaning offices in the Loop. I've been seeing things, hearing things that remind me of what you testified about in the Crane case. But I'm scared, man. I got kids, bills, and if I lose this job, I don't know what I'll do." Harold listened to Carlos's story with the patience of someone who understood exactly what the young man was experiencing. The fear, the uncertainty, the weight of knowledge that demanded action but threatened personal security. Harold's response drew on decades of experience and the hard-won wisdom that came from having survived the worst that powerful people could inflict. "Carlos, I understand your fear because I lived with it for 17 years, but I learned something important. Being invisible didn't protect me from people who wanted to hurt me anyway. The only thing that protected me was having the courage to speak up when speaking up could make a difference. You're not alone in this. There are people who will help you do the right thing safely." That conversation led to another federal investigation, another corrupt enterprise exposed, another group of criminals held accountable for activities that had seemed untouchable because they involved wealthy people with political connections. Carlos's courage, supported by Harold's guidance and federal protection, proved once again that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they chose truth over silence. As Harold settled into bed that night, touching Maria's photograph with the gentle reverence that had become his nightly ritual, he reflected on a life that had found meaning through service to others. He'd spent most of his years being invisible, but those years had prepared him to become visible in ways that mattered most, as someone who helped others find their courage, their voice, and their own paths to justice. Harold Washington, the man who remembered everything, had become the man who helped others remember their own strength, their own dignity, and their own power to make a difference in a world that often seemed designed to silence people like them. In helping others find their voices, Harold had discovered that his own voice, quiet but strong, patient but persistent, could indeed change the world, one conversation, one testimony, one act of courage at a time. On a crisp morning in October, 3 years after Robert Crane's sentencing, Harold received a letter that represented the final chapter in his journey from invisible janitor to recognized advocate for workplace justice. The letter, written on official letterhead from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, informed him that his cooperation in the Crane investigation had led to additional arrests and convictions that had dismantled an international money laundering network responsible for funding criminal organizations in 12 countries. "Mr. Washington," the letter read, "your willingness to come forward with information about the Crane organization has resulted in the seizure of over $200 million in criminal assets and the disruption of financial networks that supported terrorism, human trafficking, and drug cartels across multiple continents. Your cooperation represents one of the most significant contributions by a civilian witness in the history of federal financial crime investigations." Harold read the letter twice, not out of pride in his own role, but out of amazement at the scope of evil that his simple observations had helped to expose. The man who had once felt powerless against Robert Crane's arrogance had actually possessed the power to strike at criminal enterprises that operated on a global scale, affecting millions of lives in ways that Harold was only beginning to understand. That same week, Elizabeth Crane visited Harold at his apartment in Pilsen, bringing with her a small wooden box that contained items she'd recovered during the liquidation of her family's assets. Inside the box was her grandmother's missing watch, the timepiece whose alleged theft had cost Harold his job and reputation, but whose recovery had become symbolic of justice restored. "Harold, I want you to have this," Elizabeth said, holding the watch with reverence befitting a family heirloom that had been pawned to finance international crimes. "Not because it belongs to you, but because you're the one who proved that some things are worth more than money. Dignity, truth, justice. My grandmother would want it to go to someone who understands those values." Harold accepted the watch with the solemnity of someone who understood its symbolic importance, but his immediate thought was not of personal ownership. "Miss Elizabeth, this watch should go to the foundation, to be auctioned for the benefit of workers who've been wronged by their employers. Your grandmother's legacy should help people who need justice but can't afford it." The auction of Elizabeth Crane's watch, held during the foundation's annual fundraising dinner, raised enough money to provide legal representation for dozens of service employees facing workplace discrimination. Harold's decision to donate rather than keep the watch demonstrated the same selflessness that had made him willing to risk his safety to cooperate with federal investigators who needed his testimony to build their case. Harold's story, documented in news articles, federal court records, and foundation publications, had become part of Chicago's history of ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things through simple courage and determination. Schools in Pilsen and other working-class neighborhoods invited Harold to speak to students about the importance of integrity, the power of careful observation, and the responsibility that citizens had to speak up when they witnessed wrongdoing. These speaking engagements revealed Harold's natural gift for connecting with young people who felt invisible in their own lives, who believed that their voices didn't matter in a world dominated by wealth and political power. Harold's message was both simple and profound. Every person mattered, every voice had power, and justice was possible when good people refused to remain silent. "Young people," Harold would say, standing before assemblies of teenagers who saw in him someone who understood what it meant to be overlooked and underestimated. "You don't need money or political connections to make a difference. You need courage, integrity, and the willingness to pay attention to what's happening around you. I was just a janitor, but I helped put dangerous criminals in federal prison because I remembered what I saw and found the courage to speak up about it." Harold's consulting business had grown beyond individual building assessments to include training programs for employers who wanted to create workplaces based on respect and dignity rather than fear and hierarchy. His insights into how organizations functioned from the perspective of service employees had proved invaluable to companies that understood the connection between employee morale and business success. But Harold's most important work continued to be the informal counseling he provided to service employees who felt invisible, ignored, or threatened by employers who viewed them as disposable. Harold's apartment had become a sanctuary where people could find guidance from someone who'd survived the worst that powerful people could inflict and emerged with his dignity intact. One evening, as winter was beginning to settle over Chicago, Harold received a visit from Carlos Mendoza, the young janitor whose courage Harold had supported during another federal investigation. Carlos brought with him his teenage son, Miguel, who'd been accepted to community college with the help of a scholarship from Elizabeth Crane's foundation. "Mr. Washington, I wanted Miguel to meet you," Carlos said, his voice carrying the pride of a father whose courage had created opportunities for the next generation. "I wanted him to understand that heroes don't always wear suits or live in mansions. Sometimes they carry mop buckets and work nights while other people sleep." Harold's conversation with Miguel revealed the ongoing impact of his decision to cooperate with federal investigators 3 years earlier. Miguel spoke about wanting to study criminal justice, inspired by Harold's example of how ordinary citizens could support law enforcement efforts to hold powerful criminals accountable. The teenager understood that justice wasn't something that happened automatically. It required people like Harold who were willing to risk their safety to ensure that truth prevailed over money and influence. As Carlos and Miguel prepared to leave, Harold gave the young man a piece of advice that captured the essence of what he'd learned through decades of invisible service and years of visible advocacy. Miguel, remember that dignity isn't something that other people give you. It's something you carry inside yourself. Nobody can take it away from you unless you let them. And when you see wrongdoing, when you witness injustice, you have a choice. You can remain silent and safe, or you can speak up and make a difference. Choose to make a difference. That night, as Harold sat in his small apartment surrounded by letters from people whose lives had been changed by his example, he reflected on a journey that had begun with humiliation and evolved into something he'd never imagined possible, a legacy of courage that would continue long after he was gone. Harold Washington, the invisible janitor who had remembered everything, had become visible in the most meaningful way possible, as someone whose life had proved that justice didn't depend on wealth, power, or social status. It depended on good people who refused to remain silent when silence served evil more than truth. And have you ever felt invisible while you were the one holding everything together? Have you witnessed wrongdoing, but stayed silent because you feared the consequences of speaking up? Tell me your story in the comments, because every story of courage begins with someone who decided that truth mattered more than personal safety. If Harold's journey from invisible janitor to recognized advocate touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this story reaches someone else who needs to understand that their voice matters, their dignity is real, and their courage can change the world. For more stories that honor the quiet heroes who work while others sleep, who observe while others ignore, and who remember what others want forgotten, check out our podcast links. Thank you for walking this path with Harold Washington, for understanding that heroism comes in many forms, and for believing that justice is possible when good people refuse to remain silent. We'll see you in the next story, where ordinary people continue to prove that extraordinary change is always possible.